Since cannabis was legalized in Canada almost 5 years ago, fortunes have been made and the entire landscape of buying and selling pot has transformed. What that leaves unsaid, however, is recognition that communities disproportionately hurt before that have often not been the same people who have benefited after. Waiting to Inhale, Cannabis Legalization and the Fight for Racial Justice is a new book that lays it all out. With us to explain, the two co-authors, in New York, Tahira Rehmatullah, who is a partner in Highlands Venture Partners and CEO of the wellness and fitness company Commons. And here in our studio, Akwasi Owusu-Bempah, professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, Race Equity Lead, Center on Drug Policy Evaluation. Welcome to you in studio. And Tahira, thank you so much for joining us on the line. Akwasi, I'm going to start with you. How did you get interested in cannabis as a policy issue?
So I'm a criminologist and someone who studies inequality in our criminal justice system. And it's almost impossible to do that without examining the impact that our drug laws have had on fostering and drug law enforcement on fostering the overrepresentation we see of Black, Indigenous, Latino people, not only in our correctional facilities, but kind of throughout the criminal justice system. And cannabis is one of the most commonly used illicit substances where it's illegal and legal drugs. And so I couldn't do my work on inequality in the justice system without looking at cannabis.
All right. Tahira, I know there's a family connection in terms of really getting the start. Explain that to me and how you got started with cannabis policy.
Yeah, so it started really with my grandfather in 2013. He was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And as what happens often with people who are, you have someone in their life who's suffering, we want to find something that will help them. And so it was actually my mother, of all people, who started doing a lot of research and kept coming across cannabis. And that really sparked an interest for me, just trying to understand more. It was 2013. They lived in Ohio. There wasn't anything available for them at that time on the legal market. And then just quickly from there, I started learning a lot more about what was happening, the history from what I knew as a child of the 80s, 1980s, Nancy Reagan, Just Say No, and realizing that a lot of that was inaccurate from what really happened during that period in the war on drugs. And what started as a research project for me became much more of a career.
All right, let's get an idea of the landscape. Cannabis has been legal in Canada for nearly 5 years, of course, October 2018. Has it been a success or failure in your eyes?
Overall, I think the fact that we got legalization to happen has been a great success. Now, with major caveats, and for me, the largest one being the inequity that still exists within our legal landscape. Our previous laws were enforced in a very inequitable manner, and as I've discussed before on the show, again, Black and Indigenous people much more likely to be arrested and feel the burden of prohibition. But they've largely been left out of the legal landscape as beneficiaries, either in industry or in other ways that legalization could have benefited them, through, for example, the redistribution of tax revenues back into those communities most harmed. So, on the whole, I'm extremely happy that we have legalization. It's an imperfect model for a number of different reasons. And of course, the business landscape at the moment is challenging. We still have, other policy areas related to cannabis that we need to work out. But by and large, as the first kind of large country to do this, I think it's been overall successful.
All right. Tahira, a little bit different, of course, when we look at the U.S., a bit fragmented in terms of where it is legal. Give us a picture for us viewers here north of the border. Where are things with legalization in the U.S.?
Although we do not have federal legalization like Canada, we do have 40 states that have medically legal cannabis. We have 23 states plus DC that have adult use. So the momentum is there. What we really need is federal policy in order to allow for companies to operate in a more efficient manner, for banking to be more flexible for all of the different businesses. So still elements of it that make it really challenging, despite the fact that there's no federal legalization. But the fact that we have almost the whole country moving in that direction is a positive sign for us.
All right. I want to read a passage from both of your books. The war on drugs, even as it burrowed deep into our cultural fabric, is nothing more than linguistic sleight of hand. Drugs are an excuse for hostilities, but the real target is the class of North American society born under siege. Make no mistake, there is a war, but it is ridiculously one-sided. This war is waged on those who live in our most marginalized inner city neighborhoods, transformed into urban battlefields by those who cloak themselves in morality while terrorizing and oppressing the racial minorities among us. Tahira, I'm going to pick that up with you. How has the war on drugs terrorized and oppressed racial minorities?
The way that we've really examined it, and combining my experience in the business side and Akwasi's research and academic experience, understanding so much of the history of this, we've seen the war on drugs and drug law enforcement largely as a way to issues social control. So a way to really focus on different communities that perhaps want to, governments want to fall in line, or they want to have different things happen. And you can see this pattern throughout the course of time, both in the US and Canada. And so when we look at drug prohibition more broadly, it all kind of leads back to racial roots. And that's something that we really wanted to point out and really illuminate by writing this book, to show where it had come from and where we think that adjustments need to continue to be made in order for it to be more effective.
Akwasi, when we associate the war on drugs, of course, we think President Nixon, we think, this is the 70s, and obviously the US. What about in Canada?
Yeah, we've had a long history of racialized drug prohibition in this country. I think, many viewers would be surprised to know that our first drug laws were actually, of course, alcohol prohibition, right, which applied only to our Indigenous population. So, we really started off there. The Opium Act of 1908 was developed as a direct response to the perceived economic threat that the Chinese population, who'd been recruited to build the railroad, was posing to white laborers on the West Coast following the completion of that railroad. And the passage of subsequent drug laws, including cannabis in the late 1920s as well, highly racialized, at least in some popular discussions. Emily Murphy, who we often celebrate as a notable Canadian, wrote extensively about the supposed threat that racialized immigrants pose to white people, by and large through their introduction of drugs and drug use to those populations. So that's really our early history. And then unfortunately, we don't have great disaggregated criminal justice data by race in Canada, unlike the United States. So it's been more challenging to trace the racial disparities in enforcement. But where they do exist, again, they demonstrate very clearly Black and Indigenous people, first with the announcement or pronouncement of a war on drugs in Canada as well in the 1980s, disproportionately leading to the increased incarceration of Black and Indigenous people. And in the lead up to cannabis legalization, we were able to obtain cannabis arrest data from major police agencies across the country that showed quite literally from Vancouver through to Halifax and the cities we were able to get that data for, that Black and Indigenous people were greatly overrepresented in those possession arrests, even though research I've been involved with colleagues at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health demonstrate that, as in the United States, drug use patterns are relatively similar across different racial groups. So this is a matter of certain aspects, social circumstances and presence on the street, et cetera, but undoubtedly racially disparate enforcement.
Tahira, I want to pick up on that idea of data and research, because unfortunately there was a lot of it lacking in the early days of cannabis. There was connections with cannabis to heroin as a Schedule I drug in the US. Talk to me a little bit about, did authorities ignore studies that spoke honestly about the effects of cannabis? And if you can give us some examples as well.
Absolutely, and this really happened during the Nixon administration, where there were several studies that were done, a range of studies that were done that were commissioned to be done, and actually only one of them showed that there were negative impacts from cannabis itself on populations, and that was the study that was utilized as a tool to then enact policy around drug enforcement. And so, it's been selective over historical times, and we've seen decently in the past that certain populations are then affiliated with certain kinds of drugs. We have Chinese with opium, we have Black populations with heroin, we have Mexicans with cannabis. And so as you look at how these populations have been joined to certain substances, this has really been beneficial to focus on data that could potentially support that, as opposed to wider data that does not. And what we're seeing now is that studies are showing that something like cannabis is as addictive as something like sugar or even something like nicotine, but certainly not more harmful to be a Schedule I narcotic like heroin. And so these are the things that are happening now over time, that as it's been more available to utilize, not only at the state level, but the federal level, to be allowed to actually study cannabis. And countries like Israel have led on that side for quite some time. So utilizing that information now, we have so many more advocates who are pushing to say, okay, this is actually the information that we have, as opposed to what's been really focused on in the past.
All right, I will admit, you guys do a great job of blending in not only the facts and the numbers and the data, but also putting a human element to the face of cannabis here. Walk me through the idea of legalization of cannabis. How did the idea first emerge? Who was sort of pushing for that?
Well, I think that depends on exactly where you look on this side of the border or elsewhere. You know, there's long been support for cannabis legalization, both in Canada and the United States, you know, going back to at least the 60s and certainly the 70s. And, you know, with respect to the commissions and the studies, you know, I think we'd be remiss not to mention the Ledane Commission here that tabled reports, you know, in the early 1970s, again, examining the potential harms or oftentimes lack thereof of cannabis to personal and public health, and advocating for suggesting legalization, which ultimately was shelved. And so there have been a variety of different interest groups who have largely championed the cause for legalization. There have been you know, a libertarian group that feel that the government shouldn't be telling people what they can do with their own bodies. I think there are people that recognize, again, the harms of prohibition. Certainly myself and other criminologists and social scientists, public health scholars would suggest that drug criminalization, drug prohibition itself is much more harmful than the substances that are often controlled, especially when you look at a societal level and how they block people from getting access to the type of treatment they may need, if they need it, to deal with the addictions issues that they have. So there, you know, a large kind of scientific body. There were the individuals, again, kind of following off of that that path that suggested, again, that prohibition is quite harmful and we need to reevaluate our approach. And then, of course, there are the medical users. And that's how legalization has largely come about. That's certainly how legalization initially came about in the Canadian context, and the same when we look at the United States. There's more availability of medicinal cannabis than there is recreational at the moment. Many states, just as Canada did, allow for medical cannabis to be accessed by patients, and then legalization follows from there. So we had, you know, our first medical regime, kind of formal medical regime in Canada in 2003. And there were several iterations of that. And there were, of course, calls to legalize, as I've said, going before that, but certainly ramping up. And so public opinion had swayed that way for a long time. There are, of course, political tensions, and I think, you know, we were somewhat slow to legalize recreationally because of the United States and concerns that the United States had with the idea. But, you know, support for legalization has come from a variety of parties. Opposition, similarly too, but there's been large support for legalization for a long time.
All right, Tahira, who are some of the early pioneers of cannabis reform?
Well, in the early days in the U.S. in particular, I think one group that we really failed to recognize are gay activists who were responding to the AIDS and HIV crisis of the 1980s. And that group really brought back this notion that cannabis was medicine, brought that back into the political discourse, because really, you know, the war on drugs started in 1971. And so that really was the early stage for the U.S. to start moving in that direction. And that was California was the first state to legalize from a medical perspective in 1996. And then that really started the wave of other states to start looking at it from a medical perspective. And you also had states like Oregon who started to look at it from the other side, which was how do we kind of, instead of the legalization element, let's focus on decriminalization. So there were policies like that started to shift across the country, and obviously now we're in a very different state than we were then. But, you know, thinking about those activists in the early days who were responding to very specific things that were happening that other groups were not paying enough attention to, or there weren't resources for. Today, it's a whole range of bodies who are focused on it. You know, anything from business to when we think of economic empowerment, social equity groups, and also people like Akwasi, myself, who look at it from the racial justice lens as well, on who has the ability to engage in this business now that it has become something that is legalized in a lot of different forms. But a lot of people are still being left on the sidelines because of that, because of the past. And then, you know, beyond that, it's always a political initiative, no matter where you look at it, and it's become quite a bipartisan issue, because on one side, you know, it's health, it's wellness, it's letting people have choice, and then on the other side, it's about taxes and revenue. Right. So you can pretty much make a case for anybody on any side of the table to support cannabis and other drug policy initiatives.
All right, let's talk the human toll. I want to read another passage from your book. This time, you are quoting Bruce Western, the co-director of the Justice Lab at New York Columbia University, and his colleague Becky Pettit. It reads, Clear majorities of the young men in poor communities are going to prison and returning home less employable and more detached from their families. In this situation, the institutions charged with public safety have become vitally implicated in the unemployment and the fragile family structure characteristic of high crime communities. For poorly educated young men in highly incarcerated communities, a prison record now carries little stigma. Incentives to commit to the labor market and family life have been seriously weakened. Akwasi, there are numerous examples in the book of Black men and women who were convicted and incarcerated for selling marijuana. Is there one story that sticks out to you?
Oh, that's a very good question, and one that we get a lot. And, Michael Thompson's an individual who we profile in the book, and he now has a project, the Michael Thompson Clemency Project. He was ultimately convicted of possessing a very small quantity of cannabis, one that, especially in the Canadian context, but even there in the US where he was ultimately convicted, was a small possession count. Now, he had a previous record, but he was initially sentenced to 42 to 60 years for the subsequent cannabis offense, and he spent decades in jail as a result of this offense. And his story, an individual who was struggling to make ends meet in many ways in the already marginalized community that he lived in, to be sent to jail, to prison, for such an extended period of time, especially as legalization was taking hold in the United States. I think there were several stories that we profile in the book, and this is something that we'd hear often, is that the individuals, again, often coming from marginalized neighborhoods, who were arrested and ultimately convicted, and some of whom were imprisoned for possessing or even trafficking in quantities of cannabis that would be, just snickered at by people operating in the legal cannabis industry now. To have them still behind bars while this legal industry was operating in the jurisdiction in which they were incarcerated, myself and the individuals affected found, just so highly offensive. And so Michael Thompson, and again, he's doing great work now through his Clemency Project to bring awareness to the toll of the war on drugs and the need really for repair, but the stories were numerous.
All right, Tahira, I want to get your take as well. Was there anyone else that stuck out that was quite an important story that you guys were like, this is a story we need to share?
Yeah, another one that we do share is about Evelyn LaChapelle. She was a young mother in California, and she ended up spending 87 months in prison after a 2013 arrest for what is viewed as a small role in a cannabis distribution operation. She never touched the cannabis herself, never actually distributed it. She actually had a partner who was using her bank account. And so for that, she ended up getting 87 months. She was in solitary confinement. She had no previous record, and she ended up being released in 2018, but was and has now become a social justice advocate. She has her own business in the cannabis space, but it's impacted her in a way that, we hear the story all the time, is that this record follows you around. You aren't able to get the resources that you need. You're not able to get jobs. And she is somebody who was actually college educated. And so you would think that she could come out and have so many more opportunities, but that's really not the case. And so really just looking at, the different socioeconomic people who came in from different areas, different backgrounds, and the impact that it's had on them is so devastating that it is really hard to wrap your mind around how we've allowed that to continue to happen. And it still continues to happen today. I mean, we even have an example of someone who was sentenced to life in prison for selling the equivalent of $20 worth of cannabis. And that just was retried, and he was resentenced to not life in prison, but 45 years. So still, it's not that much better. And we're seeing these stories continue to play out.
I'm just curious, Akwasi, when we look at sort of the terms and the sentences we're hearing, when we hear 87 months, we're hearing numerous years, how can we compare that to the laws here in Canada? We're not seeing those type of extreme punishments.
Certainly not in recent times. In the 1970s, you could get a prison sentence for possessing a small quantity of cannabis. More recently, our laws and the enforcement got, somewhat more lax. To give viewers a sense, though, there were about 50,000 cannabis simple possession arrests a year in the 2 decades leading up to legalization. Now, many of those cases, yes, would have been, filtered out of the system before someone was even convicted. Very few people would ultimately have been incarcerated for a possession offense. But in the book, and we've said this many times, we see cannabis as a gateway drug. Not a gateway to harder drug use, but a gateway into the criminal justice system for our most marginalized populations. So in my work, I'm working on a file on a case at the moment, and there's an individual who's currently serving a life sentence for a very serious offense. But when you look back through his life history and his record, his first conviction was a simple cannabis possession conviction. Then an individual, as many others do, end up, perhaps getting a period of probation, but then there are conditions attached to that probation, which they may not be able to abide by, and so they might get a failure to comply with those conditions. Or again, because an individual has a criminal record, it's harder to complete school, to get a job, to essentially operate normally in our society, and so that can start a cycle of incarceration. So yes, our laws have been less harsh in the Canadian context, but I don't want to diminish the impact that cannabis criminalization has had. And we talk about it's not just on these individuals, right? Their families are affected because they have to pay legal costs, and those individuals can contribute less to their families, but entire communities. When you look at the arrest data that we got, cannabis enforcement is concentrated again in our more marginalized neighborhoods, and that depletes social capital from those neighborhoods. So we spent, and we have spent, billions of dollars policing a war on drugs in Canada and through the justice system. That's billions of dollars that have gone to police, to courts and corrections to wage a war that is clearly not being won, while at the same time taking money away from schools, from hospitals and community centers in those very neighborhoods, which would help them be healthy and vibrant neighborhoods.
All right, I want to ask you a follow-up to that. You give some policy recommendations in the book, including expunging the records of people convicted of cannabis offense, of course, simple possession as well. In your book, you kind of lay it out in a comical way because of sort of the challenges that one would have to go through. And not only here in Canada, when we have paper records, it's kind of all muddled. What would that entail to kind of go through that process?
Yeah, in the Canadian context, and thankfully some things have changed since we wrote the book. Our government's now passed laws that would have simple possession or convictions records for all drugs, essentially sealed after a period of time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who has a record is going to benefit from that because of the way in which records, as you've kind of noted, were stored and where ancillary records may exist. But we initially had this system where people had to apply and go through an 8 or 12-step process depending on who you were. It was supposed to be free, but you had to pay to get your fingerprints, et cetera. And it was a largely arduous process. The government estimated 10,000 people would be eligible for its program. There were numbers as high as 500,000. The last time I got my hands on the numbers, about 550 people had successfully received a record suspension. So that system was, an abject failure, as it had been described by others.
All right, Tahira, Akwasi had mentioned it as well, redistributing the revenue from legal sales into the communities most harmed. Tell me what that would look like. Expand on that idea, and why hasn't that been something that hasn't necessarily been picked up, on both sides?
Well, one way that we look at it is the savings that could exist if we stopped enforcing the laws in a certain way and really channeled those resources in a different way. So just think of the savings alone that you could have if you weren't focused on putting people in jail, which we estimate is between $70,000 and $75,000 per person just to get them through and process them and put them in jail. And so if you think of just that number alone and multiply that by however many, those savings could be reallocated in a way to the community, to hospitals, to schools, to other public resources. Beyond that, when we look at cannabis legalization, what has happened more in the US is that there are carve-outs that are starting to happen in order to, from tax revenue, in order to then apply towards social equity applicants or those who have been harmed by the war on drugs or marginalized in some way. We haven't really seen that play out yet. It's still quite early to be able to see the results of that. But that is another way, too, that the benefits of cannabis legalization to then factor back into communities. One piece of that, though, is that why is cannabis legalization the only resource to actually help these communities to actually, when a whole range of policies, not just cannabis making that illegal, but a whole range of other things have factored into it. So that kind of idea around reparations. And that's why we think that the savings element is so important, because if you stop enforcing these ridiculous, draconian policies that we've had for so long, you can really channel those resources in a much more broad way to people don't have to necessarily be affiliated or have a family member who was impacted by cannabis. It's more broadly what's happened, as Akwasi was saying, to these communities that's really led to people being in a cycle of poverty. And we see that all over the country. We see that that in the U.S., we see that in Canada, and that's really a way that we think that communities can really benefit largely by legalization, is to think of those two-pronged elements as well.
Yeah. And just following up on that piece, there are some great models that we profile in the book. Tahira's in New York, where legalization hasn't necessarily rolled out in the way that it was anticipated. But when you look at
just
Illinois,
give us 2 years.
When you look at Illinois, for example, like they'd set up a fund that takes a proportion of the tax revenues generated from legal sales to go directly back into the communities most harmed, right? And that's something that was certainly missing from the Canadian context. When we go back to our legalization, there was no conversation around social justice being had at all. It was really around public health, public safety, and protecting youth. And so there's a huge amount of space in Canada to kind of model some of the initiatives that we're seeing south of the border, both with respect to inclusion in industry, but certainly with respect to the redistribution of the revenues, as Tahira has rightly said, that are saved from law enforcement and criminal justice, as well as pulling from the billions of dollars that are being made from legal cannabis.
We have about 30 seconds left, Akwasi. I do want to ask you one question. I imagine when you are talking about the cannabis industry at various conferences, you're probably looking around the room. You are probably one of a few people of color in that room, in that space. And I imagine that's how sort of you guys had connected in taking space in this industry. And I do ask, how do you make the cannabis industry more inclusive? Because there are people who are doing that right now. How do you change that from looking at it through a criminalization side of it to being active participants?
It's a great question. As you've said, we're about 5 years out from legalization here. Our 3-year review of the Cannabis Act is currently underway. And I think one of the clearest things that the Canadian government could do is expand the purpose of the Cannabis Act to include social responsibility, and I would add social justice. And the social responsibility aspect comes from the legislation that basically enables the Ontario Cannabis Store. And that would allow for a range of initiatives, both government directed as well as from industry. Government can incentivize the diversification of industry through, waiving regulatory fees for companies that report their diversity statistics, for example, by incentivizing in other ways companies to diversify. I wouldn't necessarily recommend people running in now because of the state of our industry, but then also incentivizing industry to do the same thing as well, recognizing that having a diverse board of directors, C-suite, and workforce is essentially good for business. Diverse companies outperform their non-diverse peers. And so, and I think that, the market will also recognize that. My research has shown that there are certain groups that don't want to engage with legal cannabis because they don't see it as fair, they don't see it as just, and they may be more likely to do so if they see cannabis companies and brands that reflect themselves and their interests.
All right, we are going to have to leave it there. Tahira, Akwasi, thank you so much. Very important story. Really appreciate you coming on the program tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.